They are paying thousands just to learn how to smile at you again. It sounds insane until you realize it is already happening. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it because the same group that spent decades pushing men away is now quietly building classrooms dedicated to pulling men back in. What you are looking at is not confidence. It is not empowerment. It is not progress. It is a correction. And corrections are never gentle. Stay with me on this because by the time this is done, you are going to understand why everything feels off right now, why the energy has shifted, and why so many people cannot explain what is happening, even though they feel it every day. At first glance, it almost feels like a parody. Women enrolling in programs that teach them how to walk, how to talk, how to make eye contact, how to hold a conversation, how to appear warm, how to appear approachable, how to appear interested. Think about that for a second and let it settle in. These are not skills that should require instruction at that level. These are not secrets hidden behind some ancient door. These are basic social behaviors that used to be learned naturally through community, through family, through experience. But now they are being packaged, priced, and sold like some kind of elite knowledge, and people are buying it not because they want to, but because they feel like they have to. And that is where the story actually begins, because people do not spend thousands of dollars to relearn something basic unless something fundamental has broken. You do not sign up for a class to learn how to smile at another human being unless the natural ability to connect has been disrupted so deeply that it no longer comes instinctively. That is not a small shift. That is not a trend. That is a signal. What you are watching right now is not a random phase. It is the aftershock of a long chain of decisions that have been building for decades. And the reason it feels so chaotic is because the cause and the effect are finally meeting each other in real time. For years, the message was clear. Men were told to step back. Men were told to stop approaching. Men were told that their presence was unwanted, that their attention was intrusive, that their involvement was unnecessary. And for a long time, a lot of men resisted that message because it went against everything they were taught growing up. They were taught to pursue, to initiate, to provide, to protect, to engage. But eventually, repetition does what repetition always does, it reshapes behavior. You tell someone something enough times, and eventually they stop questioning it, they stop arguing with it, they accept it. And that is exactly what happened. Men listened, not all at once, not in some coordinated way, but gradually, quietly, individually, they started stepping back. And here is the part that people underestimated. When men stepped back, they did not collapse. They did not fall apart. They did not become desperate. They adapted, they adjusted, they found ways to live without the constant pressure, to perform, to provide, to pursue. They simplified their lives. They reduced their expenses. They focused on themselves. They built routines that did not revolve around seeking validation or approval. They discovered something that was never supposed to be discovered at scale, which is that they could be content on their own terms. And once that realization sets in, it changes everything because now you are not dealing with someone who needs something from you. You are dealing with someone who has options, including the option to opt out entirely. That is a completely different dynamic. While all of this was happening, something else was unfolding at the same time. The economic environment started shifting. Costs went up, stability went down, opportunities became less predictable. And in that kind of environment, the safety nets that people assumed would always be there started to feel less reliable. Systems that were expected to support individuals indefinitely began showing signs of strain. And when that happens, people start looking around for stability again. Now, combine those two things. On one side, you have men who have learned how to live independently, who have reduced their reliance on relationships, who have found peace in simplicity. On the other side, you have women who were encouraged to prioritize independence, who were told that they did not need men, who were guided towards self sufficiency, but are now facing an environment where that independence comes with a level of pressure that was never fully explained. And this is where the tension begins, because independence sounds empowering in theory, but in practice, it comes with responsibility, with risk, with uncertainty. It means carrying the full weight of your decisions without a built in support system. It means navigating financial challenges, emotional challenges, and social challenges without the kind of backup that previous generations relied on. For a while, that trade off felt worth it because the benefits were immediate and visible: freedom, autonomy, control. But over time, the long term costs started becoming more apparent: loneliness, burnout, financial strain, a lack of stability that becomes more noticeable as time goes on. And now you have a situation where the same group that was told they did not need men is now actively trying to relearn how to attract men, how to engage with men, how to connect with men, not because they suddenly changed their values overnight, but because reality has a way of forcing adjustments. Those schools, those programs, those courses, they are not the cause of the problem. They are the symptom. They are the visible part of something much deeper. They exist because there is a demand, and that demand is coming from a place of urgency. Think about the psychology behind it. When someone feels like they are losing access to something they once had, they become more focused, more intentional, sometimes even more desperate in trying to regain it. That is human nature. It is not limited to one group or another. It is how people respond to perceived loss. But here is where it gets complicated. The people they are trying to reconnect with have already moved on, not necessarily to someone else, but to a different way of living. And once someone has adjusted to a new way of life, it is very difficult to pull them back into the old one, especially if the old one came with costs that they are no longer willing to pay. So now you have this mismatch: effort on one side, indifference on the other, outreach on one side, withdrawal on the other. And that creates frustration, confusion, even resentment, because it feels like the rules changed without warning, even though the change was actually gradual and predictable. You can see it in the way people talk now. Questions like, why are men not approaching anymore? Why are relationships harder to find? Why does everything feel disconnected? These are not random questions. They are reflections of a shift that has already happened. There are events where the imbalance is almost surreal, large gatherings where one side shows up in overwhelming numbers and the other side barely appears at all. And instead of asking what changed, people try to force the old expectations onto the new reality. They assume that if they just try harder, if they just learn the right techniques, if they just adjust their behavior slightly, everything will go back to the way it was. But that is not how this works, because the foundation itself has changed. This is not about tactics, it is about incentives. It is about what people value, what they prioritize, what they are willing to invest in, and what they are willing to walk away from. And right now, a lot of men have decided that the cost of participation is higher than the benefit. That is the part that is difficult for many people to accept because it challenges a long held assumption that men will always pursue, that they will always initiate, that they will always compete for attention. But when the environment changes, behavior changes with it. At the same time, there is a growing realization that independence without support can become isolation, and that isolation becomes more difficult to manage as time goes on. That is not a criticism, that is an observation. Human beings are social by nature. They are not designed to operate completely alone indefinitely. And when the structures that used to facilitate connection break down, people start searching for ways to rebuild them. But rebuilding something is not as simple as deciding to rebuild it. It requires alignment, it requires mutual interest, it requires trust. And trust is not something that can be recreated overnight, especially if it has been eroded over time. So, what you are seeing now is an attempt to bridge a gap that has been widening for years. classes that teach behavior, strategies that focus on attraction, techniques that promise results. But none of those things address the underlying issue, which is that the relationship between these two groups has fundamentally changed. You cannot solve a structural problem with surface level adjustments. You cannot fix a disconnect by teaching someone how to smile differently. Because the issue is not the smile, the issue is everything that led to the moment where the smile no longer had the same effect. And this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable because it requires accountability, not in a blaming sense, but in a recognition sense. Understanding that actions have consequences, that choices have long term effects, that cultural shifts do not happen in isolation. They create ripple effects that take time to fully reveal themselves. For decades, the focus was on short term gains, immediate benefits, expanding options, reducing reliance. And those goals were achieved to a significant extent. But the long term trade offs were not fully considered, or if they were dismissed as unlikely or irrelevant. Now, those trade offs are becoming visible and they are not easy to reverse because they are tied to habits, to expectations, to systems that have been in place for a long time. And while all of this is happening, the economic pressure continues to build. Costs do not wait for social dynamics to stabilize. Bills do not pause while people figure things out. Reality moves forward regardless of whether people are ready for it. This creates a situation where the need for stability becomes more urgent, but the traditional paths to that stability are no longer functioning the way they used to. And that is where the tension intensifies because now the stakes are higher. People are not just looking for connection, they are looking for security, for support, for reliability in an environment that feels increasingly unpredictable. And when those needs are not being met, the response becomes more intense. That is why you are seeing the rise of these programs, these courses, these strategies. They are attempts to regain control in a situation that feels out of control. They are attempts to create certainty where there is uncertainty. But here is the reality that does not get talked about enough. You cannot negotiate desire. You cannot manufacture genuine interest through technique alone. You cannot rebuild a system by focusing only on the visible parts while ignoring the underlying structure. And until that is understood, there will continue to be a disconnect between effort and outcome. Now, step back and look at the broader picture. You have a society where traditional roles have been redefined, where expectations have shifted, where independence has been emphasized, where reliance has been reduced. And at the same time, you have an economic environment that is becoming more challenging, more demanding, more uncertain. Those two trends are moving in opposite directions. And when that happens, something has to give. For a long time, the assumption was that systems would adapt, that new structures would emerge, that people would find ways to navigate these changes smoothly. But adaptation takes time. And in the meantime, people are left dealing with the gap between what was promised and what is actually happening. And that gap is where frustration lives. It is where confusion grows. It is where people start questioning the narratives they were given. You can see it in the way conversations are shifting. There is less certainty, less confidence, more questioning, more second guessing. People are starting to look at the outcomes and compare them to the expectations. And when those two things do not match, it forces a reevaluation. But reevaluation is not comfortable. It requires admitting that some assumptions were wrong, that some decisions had unintended consequences, that some paths led to outcomes that were not anticipated. And that is where we are right now. In the middle of that process, not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the part where things are being reassessed in real time. Some people are adapting, some are resisting, some are trying to go back, some are trying to push forward. And all of those responses are happening at the same time, which is why everything feels so unstable. But beneath all of that, there is a simple truth that is starting to emerge, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. Relationships are not guaranteed. Attention is not guaranteed. Support is not guaranteed. Those things have to be built, maintained, and reciprocated. And when the balance of that exchange changes, the entire dynamic changes with it. Right now, a lot of men have decided that they are no longer willing to participate under the previous terms. They are not interested in playing a role that does not benefit them. They are not interested in investing time, energy, and resources into something that does not provide a return that they value. And at the same time, a lot of women are realizing that the independence they were encouraged to pursue comes with a level of difficulty that was not fully communicated, that it requires a different kind of resilience, a different kind of planning, a different kind of support system. And when those realizations happen simultaneously, it creates a collision. Not a physical one, but a psychological one. Expectations meeting reality, narratives meeting outcomes. That is what you are watching right now. Not a sudden change, but the visible phase of a long developing shift. And the reason it feels so intense is because it touches on fundamental aspects of life: connection, stability, purpose, identity. These are not surface level topics. These are core elements that shape how people live, how they think, how they interact. When those elements are disrupted, the effects are widespread. They show up in personal relationships, in social dynamics, and in economic behavior, in cultural conversations. And that is why something as seemingly small as a class teaching someone how to smile can actually be a window into a much larger transformation, because it tells you that something that used to be natural is no longer natural, that something that used to be intuitive now requires instruction, that something that used to happen organically now needs to be engineered. And when that happens, it is not just about the behavior, it is about the system that supports that behavior. So when you hear about these programs, do not focus on the surface level details. Do not get caught up in the idea of techniques or strategies. Look at what they represent. They represent a shift in demand, a shift in priorities, a shift in the way people are approaching connection. And more importantly, they represent a recognition, whether conscious or not, that something has changed in a way that cannot be ignored, because people do not invest time and money into solving a problem unless they believe that problem is real. And right now, the problem is very real. What makes this even more revealing is not just that these programs exist, but how they are being marketed and who they are attracting. The messaging is not subtle, it speaks directly to urgency, to scarcity, to the fear of missing out on something that used to feel automatic. It frames connection as a skill that has to be optimized, refined, and executed with precision, almost like a performance. And the people signing up are not doing it out of curiosity. They are doing it because something in their lived experience has told them that what they were doing before is no longer working. That realization does not happen in isolation, it builds over time. It starts with small moments that feel off, interactions that do not go the way they used to, a lack of response where there used to be engagement, a silence where there used to be attention. At first, those moments can be explained away. Maybe it is timing, maybe it is circumstance, maybe it is just bad luck. But when those moments start stacking up, when the pattern becomes consistent, it forces a different kind of reflection. And that reflection often leads to a question that people do not like to ask, which is what changed. Not what is wrong with others, not what is wrong with the environment, but what actually shifted in the dynamic itself. Because when a pattern changes at scale, it is rarely random. It is usually the result of multiple factors converging at the same time. One of those factors is expectation. For a long time, expectations were built around a certain set of assumptions about how relationships form, how attraction works, how people interact. Those assumptions were reinforced by culture, by media, by social norms. They created a kind of script that people followed, often without even realizing it. But scripts only work when everyone involved is still following them. The moment one side stops, the entire structure starts to break down. And that is exactly what has happened. The script has been disrupted, not replaced, just disrupted. And when there is no clear replacement, People are left trying to improvise in a situation where they are not sure what the rules are anymore. That uncertainty is uncomfortable. It creates hesitation, second guessing, overthinking. It turns what used to be natural into something that feels forced. And when something feels forced, it loses its authenticity, which makes it even less effective. So now you have people trying to compensate for that by seeking guidance, by looking for frameworks, by trying to systematize something that used to be organic. But the more you try to systematize human connection, the more it starts to feel like a transaction rather than an interaction. And that is where the disconnect deepens because genuine connection does not respond well to rigid structures. It requires flexibility, spontaneity, a certain level of unpredictability. When you try to control it too tightly, it becomes mechanical, and people can sense that. At the same time, there is another layer to this that is often overlooked, which is the role of attention itself. Attention used to be something that was exchanged more freely. It was part of everyday interactions, but over time, attention has become more selective, more intentional, more guarded. Part of that is due to the sheer volume of stimuli people are exposed to on a daily basis. When you are constantly being pulled in different directions, you become more protective of where you focus your time and energy. You start filtering more aggressively, you start prioritizing differently. And when that happens, the threshold for engagement increases. It is not enough to just show up. It is not enough. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. To follow the old patterns. There has to be a reason, a value, a sense that the interaction is worth the investment. That shift in attention is subtle, but it has a significant impact. It changes how people evaluate interactions, how they respond to approaches, how they decide where to invest their time. And when you combine that with the disruption of traditional scripts, it creates a landscape that is much harder to navigate. Now, layer in the economic aspect because this is not happening in a vacuum. People are dealing with financial pressure, with uncertainty about the future, with a need to prioritize stability. And when resources feel limited, whether that is time, money, or energy, people become more selective about how they use them. For many men, this has translated into a decision to simplify, to reduce unnecessary expenses, to focus on what they can control. That includes limiting involvement in situations that feel unpredictable or costly, not just financially, but emotionally. And once that mindset takes hold, it becomes self reinforcing. The less you engage, the less you feel the need to engage. The more you focus on your own routines, your own goals, your own stability, the more comfortable you become in that space. It is not about avoidance, it is about optimization. It is about choosing the path that provides the most consistency with the least amount of friction. And for many, that path does not currently include traditional relationships. On the other side, there is a growing awareness that independence, while valuable, does not automatically provide stability. It provides freedom. But freedom without structure can become overwhelming, especially in an environment that is already unpredictable. So now you have people trying to balance two competing needs: the desire for autonomy and the need for support, the desire for control and the need for connection. And finding that balance is not straightforward because the conditions that used to make it easier to achieve have changed. That is why the response is becoming more strategic. People are looking for ways to increase their chances, to improve their outcomes, to reduce uncertainty. But strategy without alignment does not produce the desired results. You can refine your approach, you can adjust your behavior, you can learn new techniques, but if the underlying incentives are not aligned, those changes will have limited impact. And that brings us back to the core issue, which is alignment, not just in terms of what people say they want, but what they are actually willing to invest in, what they are actually prioritizing, what they are actually valuing in practice. Because there is often a gap between stated preferences and actual behavior. People might say they want connection, but their actions might prioritize independence. People might say they value stability, but their decisions might introduce instability. That gap creates confusion because it sends mixed signals. And when signals are mixed, it becomes harder to interpret intent, harder to build trust, harder to establish consistency. Trust, in particular, is a critical factor here. It is not something that can be assumed. It has to be built over time through consistent behavior. And when there has been a period of disruption where expectations have shifted and patterns have changed, trust becomes more difficult to establish. People become more cautious, more guarded, more selective about who they let into their lives. And that caution is not irrational, it is a response to uncertainty. But caution also slows things down. It reduces the number of interactions, the depth of interactions, the willingness to take risks. And while that can protect individuals from negative outcomes, it also limits the potential for positive outcomes. So now you have a situation where both sides are operating with increased caution, increased selectivity, increased awareness of potential costs. And that creates a bottleneck because fewer interactions means fewer opportunities for connection. And when opportunities decrease, competition for those opportunities increases, which can lead to more pressure, more anxiety, more attempts to stand out. That is another reason why these programs are gaining traction. They promise an edge, they promise a way to stand out in a crowded and uncertain environment. They offer the idea that with the right approach, you can increase your chances. But again, that focus on standing out can sometimes miss the bigger picture, which is whether the environment itself is conducive to the kind of connections people are seeking. Because you can have the best approach in the world, but if the environment is not aligned, if the incentives are not aligned, if the expectations are not aligned, the results will still be limited. And that is where a lot of the frustration is coming from. People are putting in effort, they are trying new strategies, they are investing time and money, but the outcomes are not matching the expectations. And when that happens, it can lead to a cycle of escalation, trying harder, investing more, adjusting more without addressing the underlying issue. But the underlying issue is not something that can be fixed quickly. It requires a broader shift in how people think about relationships, about expectations, about roles, about responsibilities. It requires a level of introspection that goes beyond surface level adjustments. It requires looking at not just what is happening, but why it is happening and what needs to change at a deeper level. That kind of reflection is not easy. It challenges assumptions. It requires honesty. It forces people to confront uncomfortable realities. But without it, the cycle continues. More effort, more frustration, more confusion. And while all of this is unfolding, time continues to move forward. People age, circumstances change, priorities shift, and the window for certain opportunities narrows. That adds another layer of pressure because it introduces a sense of urgency, a feeling that something needs to be resolved sooner rather than later. But urgency can be a double edged sword. It can motivate action, but it can also lead to rushed decisions, to choices that prioritize short term relief over long term stability. And in a situation that is already complex, adding urgency without clarity can make things even more difficult. So, where does that leave things? It leaves them in a state of transition, not a complete breakdown, not a complete resolution, but a period where old patterns are no longer reliable and new patterns are not yet fully established. And during that period, there will be experimentation. There will be attempts to recreate what was lost. There will be attempts to build something new. There will be successes and failures. But the key factor that will determine the outcome is whether there is a willingness to address the root causes, not just the symptoms, because symptoms can be managed, but they will continue to reappear if the underlying issue is not resolved. And the underlying issue here is not just about attraction or interaction, It is about how people relate to each other in a changing environment. It is about how expectations are formed, how they are communicated, how they are adjusted over time. It is about understanding that relationships are not static. They evolve with the conditions around them. And when those conditions change significantly, the approach to relationships has to change as well. That does not mean going back to the past. It does not mean rejecting progress. It means recognizing that progress comes with trade offs, and those trade offs need to be managed consciously. It means finding a balance between independence and interdependence, between autonomy and connection, between freedom and responsibility. And that balance will not look the same for everyone. It will vary based on individual circumstances, priorities, values. But without some form of balance, the system becomes unstable. Right now, the system is adjusting, it is recalibrating, and that process is not smooth. It involves friction, it involves discomfort, it involves uncertainty, but it also involves opportunity, the opportunity to rethink, to realign, to build something that is more sustainable in the current environment. Whether that opportunity is taken or not will depend on how willing people are to engage with the deeper issues, to move beyond surface level solutions, to invest in understanding rather than just reacting. Because at the end of the day, no amount of technique can replace alignment, no amount of strategy can replace genuine interest. No amount of effort can compensate for a lack of mutual investment. And until those elements come back into alignment, the gap will remain, no matter how many programs are created, no matter how many strategies are taught. The question is not whether people will continue trying to bridge that gap. They will. The question is whether they will approach it in a way that addresses the root of the issue, or whether they will continue focusing on the surface, because the outcome will be very different depending on which path is taken. And right now, that path is still being decided. There is another layer to this that most people are not even looking at yet, and it is the shift in incentives at a structural level, because behavior does not change just because people feel like changing it. Behavior changes when the environment rewards something different. For a long time, the incentives were aligned in a way that encouraged engagement, encouraged pursuit, encouraged the building of relationships as a default path. That alignment was not perfect, but it was stable enough that most people followed it without questioning it. Now that alignment has fractured, and when incentives fracture, people do not need to be told what to do. They adjust automatically based on what makes sense in the new environment. If engaging carries more cost than benefit, people disengage. If investing carries more risk than reward, people withdraw. That is not ideology, that is adaptation. And once you understand that, you start to see why certain patterns are emerging so consistently across different places, different cultures, different groups. This is not confined to one country or one community. The same signals are appearing in multiple environments at the same time, which tells you that the underlying drivers are not local, they are systemic. When women in entirely different parts of the world start moving toward the same behavior, enrolling in similar programs, expressing similar concerns, it is not coincidence, it is convergence. It is multiple systems producing the same outcome because they are operating under similar pressures. At the same time, men across those same environments are arriving at similar conclusions, not through coordination, not through some organized effort, but through individual experience that leads to the same result. When enough individuals reach the same conclusion independently, it creates the appearance of a movement, even if there is no central direction. And that is exactly what is happening. Men are not gathering to decide to step away. They are stepping away on their own because it makes sense to them. And when enough of them do it, it changes the landscape. That change in the landscape then feeds back into the behavior of others. When opportunities decrease, the perception of scarcity increases. When scarcity increases, competition increases. When competition increases, strategies become more aggressive, more refined, more intentional. But again, if the underlying incentives are not aligned, that increased effort does not necessarily produce better outcomes. It just increases the intensity of the effort itself. And that is why you are seeing this strange combination of increased effort on one side and increased disengagement on the other. It feels counterintuitive because normally more effort should produce more results, but that only holds true when the system is responsive to that effort. When the system itself has shifted, the relationship between effort and outcome changes. This is where a lot of people get stuck because they keep applying the logic of the old system to the new one. They assume that if they just try harder, if they just refine their approach, if they just invest more, the results will follow. But if the system no longer rewards that behavior in the same way, the returns diminish. And diminishing returns are one of the most frustrating experiences because they create a sense of confusion. You are doing more, but getting less. You are investing more, but receiving less. And without a clear understanding of why that is happening, it can lead to misinterpretation. Some will interpret it as a need to double down, to push even harder, to refine even further. Others will interpret it as a signal to step back, to reassess, to reduce their involvement. And those different interpretations lead to different behaviors, which then further widen the gap. Another factor that is quietly influencing all of this is the way time is being valued. Time used to be something people were more willing to spend on exploration, on interaction, on getting to know others. There was a tolerance for inefficiency, for uncertainty, for the process itself. But as life becomes more demanding, as responsibilities increase, as pressures build, people become more protective of their time. They start asking different questions. Is this worth it? Is this likely to lead somewhere? Is this a good use of my energy? And when those questions become more prominent, casual engagement decreases. People become more selective, more intentional, more focused on outcomes. That shift in time valuation has a direct impact on how relationships form because relationships often require time without guaranteed outcomes. They require investment without certainty. And in an environment where time feels scarce, that kind of investment becomes harder to justify. So now you have fewer people willing to take that kind of risk, which reduces the number of opportunities for connection, which then increases the pressure on the remaining opportunities, which then makes those opportunities feel more significant, which then increases the stakes. And when the stakes increase, the margin for error decreases. People become less forgiving, less patient, less willing to tolerate uncertainty. They want clarity, they want direction, they want efficiency. But human connection does not operate efficiently. It is inherently unpredictable. It does not follow a straight line. And trying to force it into a more efficient framework often strips away the very elements that make it meaningful. This creates a tension between what people want and what the process requires. People want certainty, but the process involves uncertainty. People want efficiency, but the process involves exploration. People want control, but the process involves vulnerability. And when those tensions are not resolved, it creates friction. That friction shows up as hesitation, as overanalysis, as a reluctance to engage fully. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of long term consequences. People are thinking more about where their current path leads, not just in the next few months, but in the next few years, the next decade. They are evaluating decisions based on sustainability, not just immediate benefit. And that kind of thinking changes priorities. It shifts focus from short term gratification to long term stability. It encourages caution, planning, intentionality. For men, this has often translated into a focus on self sufficiency, on building a life that does not depend on external factors that are difficult to control. It means structuring their lives in a way that minimizes risk, maximizes stability, and allows for a degree of independence that reduces vulnerability. And once that structure is in place, there is less incentive to disrupt it. Introducing new variables, new uncertainties, new potential complications becomes less appealing, especially if the perceived benefits are not clear. On the other side, there's an increasing recognition that certain paths that were once promoted as optimal may not lead to the outcomes that were expected. That recognition does not happen all at once. It emerges gradually as people compare their current situation to their expectations and notice the gap. And when that gap becomes too large to ignore, it triggers a reassessment, not just of current behavior, but of past decisions, of underlying beliefs, of the narratives that guided those decisions. That reassessment can be uncomfortable because it involves questioning things that were previously accepted as true. It involves acknowledging that some choices may have led to unintended consequences, but it is also a necessary step if there is to be any meaningful adjustment. And this is where the concept of accountability becomes important, not in the sense of assigning blame, but in the sense of recognizing cause and effect, understanding that actions have outcomes, that choices shape circumstances, that decisions made over time accumulate into results. Without that recognition, it is difficult to make effective changes because you are not addressing the actual drivers of the situation. But with that recognition, there is an opportunity to adjust in a way that is more aligned with current realities. The challenge is that not everyone will engage in that level of reflection. Some will continue operating based on outdated assumptions. Some will resist change. Some will look for external explanations rather than internal ones. And that variation in response will create different outcomes for different individuals. Some will adapt successfully, finding a balance that works for them in the new environment. Others will struggle, trying to apply old frameworks to new conditions. And over time, those differences will become more pronounced. Another aspect that is worth considering is the role of social validation. For a long time, certain choices were reinforced by social approval. They were seen as desirable, as progressive, as aligned with the direction of the culture. But as outcomes become more visible, as results become clearer, the sources of validation begin to shift. What was once celebrated may become questioned. What was once encouraged may become reconsidered. And when validation shifts, behavior often follows. People are influenced by what is recognized, what is rewarded, what is respected. If certain outcomes are no longer producing the expected level of satisfaction, if they are no longer being reinforced in the same way, people start looking for alternatives. That search for alternatives is part of what is driving the current moment. People are exploring different approaches, different priorities, different ways of structuring their lives. But exploration without clear guidance can lead to confusion, to trial and error, to a period of instability before a new equilibrium is found. And that is where we are, in that period of instability, where the old patterns are fading, the new patterns are emerging, and people are trying to navigate the space in between. It is not a clean transition. It is not a smooth process. It involves uncertainty, missteps, adjustments. But it is also a necessary phase if there is to be any meaningful realignment. Because the previous alignment, while stable, was based on conditions that no longer exist in the same way. So the system has to adjust, and systems adjust through the behavior of the individuals within them. Each decision, each action, each choice contributes to the overall direction. And while no single individual controls the outcome, the collective behavior shapes the environment. Right now, that collective behavior is shifting in a way that reflects the new realities people are facing. Men are optimizing for independence, for stability, for control over their own time and resources. Women are reassessing the balance between independence and connection, between autonomy and support. And both sides are operating with a heightened awareness of risk, of cost, of long term consequences. That combination creates a dynamic that is fundamentally different from what existed before. And until there is a new alignment of incentives, expectations, and behaviors, the gap will persist. The question is not whether things will change, they already have. The question is how they will continue to evolve and how individuals will position themselves within that evolution. Because in a changing environment, those who adapt thoughtfully tend to fare better than those who resist or react without understanding. And understanding requires looking beyond the surface, beyond the immediate symptoms, to the deeper forces that are shaping the situation. Those forces are not always visible, but they are always present, influencing behavior, shaping outcomes, driving change. Recognizing them is the first step toward navigating them effectively. And right now, that recognition is starting to spread slowly but steadily as more people begin to see the patterns, connect the dots, and question the assumptions that no longer hold. That process will take time, but it is already underway. And as it continues, the landscape will keep shifting, not back to what it was, but towards something new that reflects the realities of the present rather than the expectations of the past. What makes this moment even more difficult to navigate is that people are still emotionally anchored to a version of reality that no longer exists. And that mismatch between expectation and reality creates a kind of invisible tension that shows up in everyday interactions without people even realizing why. You can feel it in conversations that go nowhere, in interactions that feel flat, in the absence of follow through where there used to be momentum. It is not always dramatic, it is often subtle, but it is consistent enough that it starts to shape perception. People begin to sense that something is off, even if they cannot articulate exactly what it is. Part of that comes from the way narratives were constructed over time. Narratives are powerful because they do not just describe reality, they shape how people interpret it. When a narrative is repeated often enough, it becomes a lens through which everything else is viewed. For years, certain narratives about independence, fulfillment, and self sufficiency were reinforced so strongly that they became the default framework for understanding success and happiness. Those narratives were not entirely false, but they were incomplete. And the parts that were left out are now becoming more visible. The missing piece was always the long term sustainability of those narratives when applied at scale. It is one thing for an individual to choose a path and make it work through exceptional effort or unique circumstances. It is another thing for an entire population to follow the same path and expect the same outcomes. Systems behave differently when they are scaled up. What works for a minority does not always translate when it becomes the majority approach. And that is what is being tested right now. The scalability of certain life choices, the long term viability of certain priorities, the ability of individuals to maintain stability without the structures that previously supported them. These are not theoretical questions anymore. They are practical realities that people are encountering in their daily lives. When those realities do not match the expectations that were set, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. People start asking themselves whether they misunderstood something, whether they were misled, whether the conditions changed, or whether the outcomes were never guaranteed to begin with. And those questions do not have simple answers because the situation is the result of multiple factors interacting over time. Another aspect that is becoming more apparent is the role of reciprocity. Relationships in any form rely on some level of mutual exchange. It does not have to be equal in every moment, but over time, there needs to be a balance. When that balance is perceived to be off, when one side feels like they are giving more than they are receiving, or that the exchange is not aligned with their expectations, it creates dissatisfaction. For a long time, there was an assumption that certain contributions would always be made by one side and certain contributions would always be made by the other. That division was not always fair, but it was predictable. Now that predictability has been disrupted and the expectations around contribution are less clear. When expectations are unclear, people default to protecting their own interests. They become more cautious about what they give, more selective about where they invest, more aware of potential imbalances, and that awareness changes behavior. Men in particular have become more conscious of what they are contributing and what they are receiving in return. They are evaluating interactions not just based on immediate satisfaction, but on long term value. They are asking whether the exchange makes sense for them, whether it aligns with their goals, whether it justifies the investment. And if the answer is not clear, they are more willing to step back, to disengage, to focus elsewhere. That willingness to disengage is a significant shift because it removes the assumption that participation is automatic. On the other side, there is a growing realization that certain expectations about what will be provided are no longer reliable, that what was once assumed to be available may no longer be offered, at least not under the same conditions. This creates a situation where both sides are recalibrating their expectations at the same time, but not necessarily in a coordinated way. Each side is responding to their own experiences, their own incentives, their own interpretation of the environment. And because those responses are not perfectly aligned, it creates friction, misunderstandings, mismatched expectations, interactions that do not progress the way either side anticipated. Another factor that is influencing all of this is the changing perception of value itself. What people value, what they prioritize, what they consider important has shifted over time. And those shifts are not always synchronized across different groups. For some, value is increasingly tied to stability, to predictability, to control over their environment. For others, value may still be associated with experience, with exploration, with flexibility. And when those value systems interact, there can be a disconnect because what one person sees as an opportunity, another may see as a risk. What one person sees as a benefit, another may see as a cost. And without a shared understanding of value, it becomes harder to align expectations. This is particularly relevant in the context of long term planning. People are thinking more about where their current choices will lead, about what kind of life they want to build, about what they are willing to compromise on and what they are not. And those considerations influence how they approach relationships, how they evaluate potential partners, how they decide whether to engage or not. If the perceived long term outlook does not align, if the risks seem too high, if the potential for conflict seems significant, people are more likely to opt out rather than take the chance. That risk aversion is not necessarily a negative trait. It can lead to more thoughtful decision making, to more deliberate choices, to a focus on sustainability rather than impulsiveness. But it also reduces the number of spontaneous interactions, the willingness to explore uncertain possibilities, the openness to situations that do not have a clear outcome. And again, that reduces opportunities for connection, which feeds back into the overall dynamic. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the role of external systems in shaping personal outcomes. People are recognizing that their individual efforts are influenced by broader economic, social, and cultural factors that are not entirely within their control. That recognition can lead to a sense of caution, a desire to minimize exposure to those external uncertainties. It can also lead to a focus on what can be controlled, what can be managed, what can be optimized on an individual level. For many men, that has meant creating a lifestyle that is less dependent on external validation, less influenced by social expectations, more centered on personal goals and routines. And once that lifestyle is established, it becomes self sustaining. The need for external input decreases, the reliance on others diminishes, the satisfaction derived from independence increases. This is not about isolation, it is about control. It is about creating a life that is predictable, manageable, and aligned with personal priorities. And when that life is compared to the uncertainty and potential complexity of traditional relationships, the trade off becomes clearer. On the other side, there is a recognition that complete independence can come with its own challenges. That while autonomy provides freedom, it also requires a level of responsibility and resilience that can be difficult to maintain over time. That recognition does not necessarily lead to an immediate change in behavior, but it creates a tension between the desire for independence and the need for support. And that tension is part of what is driving the current attempts to reconnect, to relearn, to rebuild. But rebuilding requires more than just intention, it requires alignment, consistency, and a willingness to adjust not just behavior, but expectations. It requires acknowledging that the environment has changed, that the rules are different, that the assumptions that once guided behavior may no longer apply. And that kind of adjustment takes time. It is not something that can be achieved through a course or a program alone. It involves a shift in mindset, in priorities, in the way people approach interactions. It involves a willingness to engage with uncertainty, to accept that not everything can be controlled, that not every outcome can be predicted. And it involves a recognition that relationships are not just about individual benefit, but about mutual investment, about shared goals, about a balance between giving and receiving. Without that recognition, attempts to reconnect may remain superficial, focused on tactics rather than substance. And superficial adjustments can only go so far. They may create temporary improvements, but they do not address the underlying dynamics. So the question becomes whether people are willing to go deeper, to look beyond the surface, to engage with the more complex aspects of the situation, because that is where meaningful change happens. Not in the refinement of techniques, but in the alignment of values, expectations, and behavior. Right now, that alignment is still in progress. It is uneven. It is incomplete. It is evolving. And during this period, there will be confusion, frustration, and a sense of instability. But there will also be opportunities to rethink, to recalibrate, to build something that is more aligned with current realities. The outcome of that process will depend on how individuals respond, how they interpret the changes, how they adjust their approach. Because in a dynamic environment, those who are able to adapt thoughtfully, to recognize patterns, to adjust their behavior in response to new information are more likely to find stability. While those who remain anchored to outdated assumptions may find themselves increasingly out of sync with the environment around them. And that divergence will shape the experiences of different individuals in different ways. Some will find clarity, others will struggle with confusion, some will build stability, others will face ongoing uncertainty. But all of it is part of a broader transition that is still unfolding, still being shaped by the collective behavior of those within it. And as that transition continues, the patterns will become clearer, the outcomes more defined, the new equilibrium more visible. But for now, it remains a process in motion, a shift that is still taking form, still revealing its full implications. Understanding that process, recognizing the forces at play, is the first step toward navigating it effectively. There is a quiet shift happening beneath all of this that does not get talked about directly. And it is the change in how people assign meaning to their own lives when external validation starts to lose its influence. Because for a long time, a significant portion of identity was tied to how others perceived you, how you were received, how you were acknowledged in social settings that reinforce certain behaviors and certain milestones as markers of success. When that external validation weakens or becomes inconsistent, people are forced to confront a different question, which is what actually matters to them when no one is watching, when there is no applause, when there is no reinforcement. And that question has a way of reshaping priorities in a very direct and sometimes uncomfortable way. Men, in particular, have been moving through that process in a way that is less visible but highly impactful. Because once you detach from the need to be constantly recognized for participation, once you stop measuring your value based on engagement with others, you begin to build an internal framework that is not dependent on approval. And that framework is much harder to influence from the outside, much harder to pull back into old patterns that relied on external feedback loops. What follows from that shift is a redefinition of satisfaction itself. Because when satisfaction is no longer tied to outcomes that require cooperation from others, it becomes more stable, more predictable, and more controllable. And that changes the entire equation of how decisions are made. Instead of asking what will make me more appealing, the question becomes what will make my life more efficient, more peaceful, more aligned with my own standards. And when those standards are met consistently, there is less incentive to introduce variables that could disrupt that balance. This is where the disconnect becomes more pronounced because the expectation on one side may still be rooted in the assumption that attention and engagement can be regained through adjustment, while on the other side, the motivation to re engage has already been reduced by the presence of an alternative that feels more reliable and less costly. There is also a psychological component to this that is often overlooked, and it is the impact of repeated negative reinforcement over time. Because when people experience a pattern of interactions that lead to outcomes they perceive as unfavorable, whether that is rejection, misunderstanding, or a sense that their efforts are not appreciated, they begin to associate those interactions with a certain level of risk. And over time, that association becomes strong enough that avoidance becomes the default response. This is not about bitterness or resentment, it is about pattern recognition. And once a pattern is established, it takes a significant amount of consistent positive reinforcement to override it, which is something that cannot be achieved through isolated efforts or short term changes in behavior. It requires a sustained shift in how interactions are experienced. And that kind of shift is difficult to produce in an environment where trust has been weakened and expectations are unclear. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the concept of opportunity cost, which is the idea that every decision to engage in one area comes at the expense of not engaging in another. And as people become more conscious of this, they begin to evaluate their choices more critically, especially when it comes to how they allocate their time and energy. For many men, the realization that time spent pursuing uncertain outcomes could be redirected toward activities that provide immediate and reliable returns has been a significant factor in their decision to step back from traditional engagement. This does not mean they are avoiding effort. It means they are redirecting it toward areas where the outcome is more directly tied to their input, where the feedback is clearer, and where the risk is lower. On the other side, there is a different kind of pressure building, and it is the pressure of expectation meeting reality in a way that is not easily reconciled. Because when people have been guided toward a certain vision of independence and fulfillment, and that vision does not fully materialize in the way it was anticipated, it creates a gap that needs to be addressed. That gap is not just practical, it is emotional because it involves a sense of dissonance between what was promised and what is experienced. And resolving that dissonance requires either adjusting expectations or changing circumstances, both of which can be challenging. This is where the urgency begins to show because the longer that gap remains, the more it influences decision making, the more it drives behavior, and the more it shapes the overall dynamic. Another factor that is contributing to the current situation is the way social environments have become fragmented because there was a time when interactions were more centralized, more consistent, and more predictable, where people met through shared spaces, shared activities, and shared communities that provided a natural context for connection. As those environments have become less cohesive, as people have moved toward more individualized and digital forms of interaction, the pathways for organic connection have become less reliable. And this has increased the reliance on structured approaches, on deliberate strategies, on environments that are specifically designed to facilitate interaction. But structured environments do not always replicate the conditions that allow for genuine connection because they often introduce an element of performance, an awareness of being evaluated, and a focus on outcomes that can interfere with the natural flow of interaction. This shift toward more structured interaction also changes the way people present themselves. Because when there is an awareness of being evaluated, there is a tendency to optimize presentation, to highlight certain traits, to minimize others, to create a version of oneself that is designed to achieve a specific outcome. And while this can be effective in the short term, it can also create a disconnect between presentation and reality, which becomes more apparent over time. That disconnect can lead to a breakdown in trust because when expectations based on presentation are not met in reality, it creates a sense of inconsistency that is difficult to reconcile. This is another reason why superficial adjustments, such as those taught in certain programs, may not lead to lasting results because they address presentation rather than substance. At a broader level, there is also a shift in how risk is perceived and managed because, in an environment that feels increasingly uncertain, people become more sensitive to potential downsides, more focused on avoiding negative outcomes. And this can lead to a more conservative approach to decision making. For men, this has often meant avoiding situations that carry a high level of unpredictability or potential cost, and instead focusing on areas where the variables are more controllable. For women, this has meant navigating a landscape where the traditional sources of support are less reliable and where the responsibility for managing risk is more directly on the individual. This difference in how risk is approached and managed contributes to the overall disconnect because it influences how each side evaluates opportunities and makes decisions. There is also an element of timing that plays a role in all of this because the stage of life that people are in affects how they prioritize different aspects of their lives. And as time progresses, the margin for experimentation decreases, the tolerance for uncertainty diminishes, and the focus shifts toward outcomes that are more aligned with long term stability. This shift in timing creates additional pressure because it means that the window for certain types of decisions is perceived to be narrowing, and that perception influences behavior in a way that can either accelerate or complicate the process of finding alignment. When urgency is introduced into an already complex situation, it can lead to decisions that are more reactive than deliberate, and that can further contribute to instability. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that not all paths lead to the same outcomes, and that the choices people make early on can have a compounding effect over time, which influences where they find themselves later. This recognition can lead to a reassessment of priorities, a reevaluation of what is considered important, and a shift in how people approach their decisions moving forward. But reassessment is not always straightforward because it involves confronting the possibility that some decisions may need to be adjusted, that some assumptions may need to be reconsidered, and that some expectations may need to be recalibrated. This process can be uncomfortable, but it is also necessary if there is to be any meaningful adaptation to the current environment. Another dimension to consider is the role of emotional resilience, because navigating a changing environment requires a certain level of stability in how people process and respond to challenges. And when resilience is low, it becomes more difficult to engage with uncertainty, to handle setbacks, to maintain a consistent approach in the face of fluctuating outcomes. For men who have shifted toward a more independent lifestyle, resilience is often built through routine, through control over their environment, through the ability to manage their own outcomes. And this creates a form of stability that is less dependent on external factors. For women who are navigating a landscape where traditional support structures are less accessible, resilience may be tested in different ways, particularly when expectations are not being met and when the path forward is not clearly defined. All of these factors are interacting at the same time, creating a situation that is complex, multifaceted, and not easily reduced to a single explanation. And that is why simple solutions are not effective, because they do not address the full scope of what is happening. The current moment is the result of long term trends, structural changes, and individual decisions that have converged to create a new set of conditions. And navigating those conditions requires a level of awareness and adaptability that goes beyond surface level adjustments. It requires a willingness to engage with the deeper dynamics, to understand the forces that are shaping behavior, and to adjust accordingly in a way that is aligned with both current realities and long term goals. As this process continues, there will be a gradual emergence of new patterns, new norms, and new expectations that reflect the environment as it exists now rather than as it existed before. And those who are able to recognize and adapt to those patterns will be better positioned to find stability within them. This does not mean that the past is irrelevant, but it does mean that relying on past assumptions without accounting for present conditions is likely to lead to outcomes that do not align with expectations. The challenge then is to find a way to integrate what has been learned with what is currently happening, to build a framework that is both informed by experience and responsive to change, and to approach decisions with a level of clarity that comes from understanding not just what is visible on the surface, but what is driving it beneath. There is a deeper consequence unfolding that most people only start to recognize when it is already affecting their day to day life. And that is the erosion of shared expectations. Because for any system involving human interaction to function smoothly, there has to be at least a loose agreement on what behaviors mean, what actions signal, and what outcomes are supposed to follow from certain patterns of engagement. When that shared understanding begins to dissolve, communication itself becomes less efficient, not because people cannot speak, but because they are no longer interpreting the same signals in the same way. And that creates a kind of friction that is difficult to pinpoint but easy to feel. What used to be obvious becomes ambiguous, what used to be predictable becomes uncertain. And that uncertainty forces people to either slow down and overanalyze or withdraw altogether to avoid missteps. And both responses reduce the likelihood of meaningful connection forming naturally. This breakdown in shared expectations is not accidental. It is the result of multiple layers of change happening simultaneously. Because when roles are redefined, when incentives shift, and when cultural messaging evolves in different directions for different groups, the result is a divergence in how people interpret the same situation. One side may see a neutral action as an opportunity, while the other sees it as an imposition. And without a common reference point, those interpretations clash rather than align. Over time, repeated misalignment leads to a reduction in engagement because people begin to anticipate that their intentions will not be understood in the way they expect, and that anticipation influences behavior before the interaction even begins. Another critical element in this shift is the way long term thinking has started to override short term impulse. Because as people become more aware of how quickly circumstances can change, they begin to evaluate decisions through a lens that prioritizes sustainability over immediate gratification. This is particularly evident in how men are structuring their lives. Because once the focus shifts toward building a stable, self contained system that minimizes risk, every potential addition to that system is evaluated based on whether it enhances or disrupts that stability. If the potential for disruption outweighs the potential for benefit, the default response becomes avoidance, not out of fear, but out of calculation. This kind of decision making is not emotional in the traditional sense, it is strategic. And once it becomes habitual, it reinforces itself because the outcomes it produces tend to validate the approach. At the same time, there is a growing tension on the other side that stems from the realization that certain safety nets are not as reliable as they were assumed to be. Because for a period of time, there was an implicit belief that independence would be supported by broader systems that would provide a buffer against instability. But as those systems show signs of strain, the responsibility shifts back to the individual in a way that was not fully anticipated. This creates a situation where the burden of maintaining stability becomes more immediate and more personal. And when that burden intersects with a landscape where traditional forms of support are less accessible, it creates a sense of urgency that drives behavior in a more focused and sometimes more reactive direction. This urgency is what fuels the search for solutions that promise efficiency and results, which is why programs that offer structured guidance gain traction, even when they do not address the root of the issue. Because in a situation where time feels limited and outcomes feel uncertain, the appeal of a clear path, even if it is incomplete, becomes stronger. But structured solutions that operate at the level of behavior without addressing the level of alignment can only go so far because they do not change the underlying dynamics that determine whether an interaction will lead to a meaningful outcome. They may improve initial engagement, but they do not necessarily sustain it because sustainability requires consistency, and consistency requires alignment. There is also a shift happening in how people perceive effort itself because effort used to be seen as inherently valuable, as something that would eventually be rewarded if applied consistently. But as people encounter situations where effort does not lead to the expected results, they begin to question not just how much effort to apply, but where to apply it. This leads to a reallocation of effort toward areas where the relationship between input and output is clearer, where the feedback loop is more direct, and where the outcomes are more predictable. For many men, this has meant investing in areas such as personal development, financial stability, and controlled environments where their actions produce measurable results rather than in areas where the outcome depends heavily on factors outside of their control. This reallocation of effort has a compounding effect because as more time and energy are directed toward self contained systems, those systems become more robust, more efficient, and more satisfying, which further reduces the incentive to divert resources toward less predictable areas. Over time, this creates a reinforcing cycle where independence becomes not just a preference, but a default state. And once that state is established, it requires a significant shift in perceived value to justify moving away from it. This is one of the reasons why attempts to re engage through surface level adjustments are often ineffective, because they do not offer a compelling enough reason to disrupt a system that is already functioning effectively on its own terms. On the other side, there is a growing awareness that independence without integration can lead to a form of isolation that becomes more pronounced over time, particularly as external conditions become more challenging. Because while independence provides control, it does not automatically provide resilience against broader systemic pressures. This realization creates a tension between the desire to maintain autonomy and the need to establish connections that can provide support. And navigating that tension requires a level of clarity about priorities that is not always present. When priorities are unclear, decisions become reactive rather than strategic, and reactive decisions tend to focus on immediate relief rather than long term stability. Another factor that is shaping the current landscape is the way information is distributed and consumed because people are now exposed to a wider range of perspectives, experiences, and narratives than at any other point in time. And this exposure influences how they interpret their own situation. When individuals see patterns emerging across different contexts, when they observe similar outcomes being reported by others, it reinforces their perception that what they are experiencing is not isolated, but part of a broader trend. This reinforcement can either validate their current approach or prompt them to reconsider it, depending on how the information aligns with their own experience. For men who have chosen to step back, seeing others make similar choices reinforces the idea that their decision is not unusual, which reduces the likelihood of reconsideration because it normalizes the behavior and removes the sense of being out of sync with the environment. For women who are encountering increasing difficulty in achieving the outcomes they were led to expect, seeing others report similar challenges can create a sense of urgency to adapt, to find new strategies, to adjust their approach in a way that improves their chances. This difference in how information is interpreted and acted upon contributes to the divergence in behavior that is currently visible. There is also a generational component to consider because different age groups are experiencing these changes at different stages of their lives, and that affects how they respond. Younger individuals may still be in a phase of exploration where the impact of long term consequences is less immediate, while older individuals may be more focused on stability and long term planning, which makes the current environment more consequential. This difference in timing creates variations in behavior that can make the overall picture more complex because it introduces multiple layers of response that are influenced by different priorities and constraints. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that certain trade offs cannot be avoided, and that choosing one path often means accepting the limitations that come with it, because every decision involves a balance between benefits and costs, and those costs may not be immediately visible, but they become more apparent over time. This recognition leads to a more deliberate approach to decision making, where individuals are more conscious of what they are gaining and what they are giving up, and that awareness influences how they evaluate opportunities and make choices. This shift toward more deliberate decision making also changes the pace of interactions because people are less likely to move quickly into situations that involve uncertainty and more likely to take time to assess, to observe, to evaluate before committing. While this can lead to more stable outcomes in the long run, it also reduces the spontaneity that often plays a role in forming connections, which further contributes to the overall reduction in engagement. As all of these factors continue to interact, the landscape becomes one where the old assumptions no longer provide reliable guidance, and new patterns are still emerging, which creates a sense of instability that is both practical and psychological. People are navigating a space where the rules are not clearly defined, where the outcomes are not guaranteed, and where the path forward requires a level of adaptability that is not always comfortable. In this kind of environment, those who are able to step back, observe the patterns, and adjust their approach based on a clear understanding of the underlying dynamics are more likely to find a path that leads to stability because they are not relying on assumptions that no longer hold, but are instead responding to the conditions as they actually exist. This does not mean that the process is easy, but it does mean that it is grounded in reality rather than expectation. And that grounding is what allows for more effective decision making. The challenge then is not just to recognize that things have changed, but to understand how they have changed, why they have changed, and what that means for how individuals should approach their choices moving forward. Because without that understanding, it is easy to fall into patterns that are no longer effective, to pursue outcomes that are no longer aligned with the environment, and to become frustrated when those efforts do not produce the expected results. But with that understanding, there is an opportunity to navigate the current landscape in a way that is more aligned with reality, more responsive to change, and more focused on building a stable foundation that can withstand the pressures of an evolving environment. And that is ultimately what determines how individuals experience this transition, not just in the short term, but over the long term as well. There is a point in any large scale shift where people stop debating whether something is happening and start quietly adjusting their lives around it. And that point is where things become irreversible, not because they cannot technically be changed, but because the momentum has already moved too far in one direction for a simple correction to bring it back. What you are watching right now is that exact phase where the conversation is still loud on the surface, but underneath it, the real decisions are already being made in silence, in routines, in habits, in the small daily choices that compound over time into a completely different lifestyle. Men are not announcing that they are opting out. They are just not showing up, not participating, not investing. And that absence speaks louder than any argument ever could because it removes the assumption that engagement is automatic. And once that assumption is gone, everything built on top of it starts to lose its foundation. What makes this shift particularly difficult to reverse is that it is being reinforced by outcomes that validate the decision to step back. Because when someone simplifies their life, reduces their obligations, and begins to experience a sense of control and predictability that they did not have before, it creates a feedback loop that strengthens the behavior. The less they rely on external factors, the more stable their environment becomes. And the more stable their environment becomes, the less incentive they have to introduce new variables that could disrupt that stability. This is not about rejecting connection. It is about prioritizing a form of stability that feels tangible and, and consistent over one that feels uncertain and conditional. And once that preference is established, it becomes the baseline from which all other decisions are evaluated. At the same time, there is an increasing pressure on the other side that is less about ideology and more about lived reality. Because when the structure that was expected to provide long term support begins to show signs of limitation, it forces a reassessment that cannot be avoided. This is where the emotional tone starts to shift. Because what was once framed as empowerment begins to feel like exposure, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one, where the responsibility for maintaining stability becomes more immediate and less abstract. When that realization sets in, it does not immediately change behavior, but it begins to influence it in subtle ways, creating a sense of urgency that gradually becomes more visible in the actions people take to adapt. This is why you are seeing a rise in attempts to reintroduce connection in a way that feels more intentional, more structured, more strategic. Because when something that was once taken for granted becomes uncertain, people do not approach it casually anymore. They approach it with focus, with planning, with a desire to increase the likelihood of success. But the challenge is that intention alone does not create alignment. And without alignment, even well planned efforts can fall short because they are operating within a system that is not responding in the same way it once did. This creates a cycle where increased effort does not necessarily produce increased results, which leads to frustration, which leads to further attempts to refine the approach without addressing the underlying shift. Another important dimension to consider is the way perception influences behavior, because perception often drives action more than objective reality. And when the perception of risk increases, even if the actual risk has not changed proportionally, people adjust their behavior accordingly. For many men, the perception of potential downsides in traditional engagement has increased to a point where the expected value of participation is no longer clear. And when the expected value becomes uncertain, the rational response is to limit exposure until there is a clear understanding of the potential outcomes. This is not about fear, it is about calculation. And once behavior becomes driven by calculation rather than assumption, it becomes more resistant to influence because it is grounded in an evaluation of risk versus reward rather than in social expectation. On the other side, there is a perception that the absence of engagement is temporary, that it is a phase, that it can be corrected through adjustments in approach. But this perception does not fully account for the structural changes that have already taken place. Because when behavior is reinforced by consistent outcomes over time, it becomes a pattern, and patterns are not easily disrupted without a significant change in the conditions that created them. This is where the mismatch in perception creates a gap because one side is expecting a return to previous dynamics while the other has already moved on to a different framework that no longer operates under the same assumptions. There is also a broader economic context that cannot be ignored because the conditions under which people make decisions are heavily influenced by the stability of the environment around them. And when that environment becomes more uncertain, people naturally gravitate toward choices that provide a greater sense of control. This is evident in how men are structuring their lives around minimizing financial obligations, reducing unnecessary expenses, and focusing on self sufficiency as a way to create a buffer against external instability. This approach not only provides immediate benefits in terms of reduced stress and increased control, but it also reinforces the idea that independence is a viable and sustainable path, which further reduces the incentive to engage in situations that introduce additional complexity. At the same time, there is a growing recognition that the cost of maintaining a certain standard of living independently can be significant, particularly in an environment where economic pressures are increasing. And this recognition creates a tension between the desire for autonomy and the practical need for support. This tension does not resolve itself quickly because it involves competing priorities that are both valid, and finding a balance between them requires a level of clarity that is not always present in the midst of change. As a result, people may oscillate between different approaches, trying to find a combination that provides both independence and stability without fully committing to one or the other. Another factor that is shaping the current dynamic is the way long term consequences are becoming more visible. Because as time passes, the outcomes of earlier decisions begin to materialize in a way that is harder to ignore. This visibility changes how people evaluate their current situation because it provides a reference point that can either validate or challenge their expectations. When the outcomes align with expectations, it reinforces the current approach. But when they do not, it prompts a reassessment that can lead to changes in behavior. This process is not uniform because individuals reach this point at different times based on their circumstances. But as more people encounter it, it contributes to a broader shift in how certain choices are perceived. There is also a shift in how people define success because success is no longer measured solely by traditional milestones, but by a combination of factors that include stability, control, personal satisfaction, and resilience. This redefinition influences how people prioritize their decisions because it changes what they are aiming for and how they evaluate whether they have achieved it. For many men, success has become more closely associated with the ability to live on their own terms, to maintain control over their time and resources, and to avoid unnecessary complications that could disrupt that control. This definition is less dependent on external validation and more focused on internal consistency, which makes it less susceptible to influence from changing social expectations. On the other side, there is a recognition that certain traditional markers of success may not be as accessible or as reliable as they once were. And this recognition creates a need to redefine success in a way that aligns with current realities. This process is ongoing and varies from person to person, but it contributes to the overall sense of transition that characterizes the current moment because it involves rethinking long held assumptions and adjusting expectations accordingly. As all of these factors continue to interact, the result is a landscape where the old equilibrium has been disrupted and a new one has not yet fully formed, creating a period of instability that is both challenging and revealing. It is challenging because it requires people to navigate uncertainty without a clear roadmap. And it is revealing because it exposes the underlying dynamics that were previously hidden by the stability of the old system. This exposure provides an opportunity to understand the forces at play in a way that was not possible before. And that understanding can inform more effective decision making moving forward. The key to navigating this period is not to resist the change or to attempt to force a return to previous conditions, but to recognize that the environment has shifted and to adjust accordingly in a way that aligns with both current realities and long term goals. This requires a level of awareness that goes beyond surface level observations, because the most significant changes are often the ones that are not immediately visible, the ones that influence behavior indirectly through shifts in incentives, expectations, and perception. Ultimately, the outcome of this transition will depend on how individuals respond to these changes, how they interpret the signals they are receiving, and how they adjust their approach in response. Those who are able to recognize the patterns, understand the underlying dynamics, and adapt their behavior accordingly will be better positioned to find stability within the new environment, while those who remain anchored to outdated assumptions may find themselves increasingly out of alignment with the conditions around them. And as this process continues to unfold, it will become clearer which approaches are sustainable and which are not. Because over time, the results of different strategies will become more apparent, providing a basis for further adjustment and refinement. This is not a process that will resolve quickly, but it is one that will continue to shape the landscape in a way that reflects the realities of the present rather than the expectations of the past. And understanding that distinction is essential for navigating what comes next. There is a moment in any transition where the emotional reaction gives way to a colder kind of clarity. And that clarity is not dramatic, it does not come with a sudden realization or a loud declaration. It settles in slowly as patterns become undeniable and outcomes become consistent enough that they can no longer be dismissed as temporary or coincidental. That is the stage this has entered, where what once felt like a fluctuation now feels like a direction. And when something feels like a direction, people begin to orient their lives around it rather than waiting for it to pass. This is where behavior changes in a way that is not easily reversed because it is no longer based on reaction, it is based on adaptation. And adaptation tends to solidify over time as it proves itself through repeated experience. What follows from that clarity is a shift in how people allocate not just their time and energy, but their attention, because attention is one of the most limited resources a person has, and where it is directed determines what grows and what fades. For men who have stepped into a more self contained way of living, attention is being redirected inward towards systems that produce consistent returns, whether that is financial stability, physical health, personal projects, or controlled environments where effort leads to measurable outcomes. This redirection is not accidental. It is the result of a deliberate decision to invest in areas where the feedback loop is reliable, where progress is visible, and where the outcome is not dependent on variables that are difficult to control. Once that pattern is established, it creates a sense of momentum that reinforces itself because the more attention is invested in these areas, the more they improve, and the more they improve, the more valuable they become in the overall structure of a person's life. At the same time, there is a diminishing tolerance for ambiguity because ambiguity introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is increasingly being treated as a cost rather than an acceptable part of the process. This is a significant change because human interaction has always involved a degree of ambiguity, a willingness to engage without knowing exactly how things will unfold. But as the environment becomes more complex and the stakes feel higher, that willingness decreases. People begin to seek clarity before they invest, to look for signals that indicate whether an interaction is likely to be worthwhile. And when those signals are not clear, they are more likely to disengage than to proceed with uncertainty. This reduces the number of interactions that even have the chance to develop because the threshold for engagement has been raised to a point where many potential connections are filtered out before they begin. On the other side, there is an increasing pressure to produce those signals of clarity, to communicate value in a way that meets the higher threshold for engagement, but doing so in a way that feels genuine rather than forced is not straightforward. This is where the tension between authenticity and strategy becomes more pronounced. Because when people attempt to present themselves in a way that is optimized for a specific outcome, there is a risk that the presentation becomes disconnected from reality. And that disconnect can be sensed even if it is not explicitly identified. Genuine connection relies on a level of consistency between what is presented and what is experienced. And when that consistency is not present, it undermines trust, which is already a limited resource in the current environment. Another layer to this is the way long term planning has started to dominate decision making. Because as people become more aware of how quickly circumstances can change, they begin to prioritize stability over exploration, to favor paths that offer predictability over those that offer potential, but come with significant uncertainty. This shift in planning influences not just major decisions, but everyday choices from how time is spent to how resources are allocated. And it creates a framework where actions are evaluated based on their contribution to a broader strategy rather than their immediate appeal. For men, this often means structuring their lives in a way that minimizes exposure to risk, that maximizes control over outcomes, and that builds a foundation that can withstand external pressures without requiring constant adjustment. For women, the shift toward long term planning is intersecting with a different set of challenges because the path that was promoted as leading to independence and fulfillment is revealing complexities that were not fully accounted for, particularly in an environment where economic conditions are tightening and support systems are less predictable. This creates a need to reassess priorities, to consider alternative approaches, and to navigate a landscape where the balance between independence and support is not clearly defined. The result is a search for strategies that can bridge that gap, but without addressing the underlying alignment between expectations and reality. Those strategies may provide only temporary relief rather than a lasting solution. There is also a growing awareness of the role of emotional investment, because emotional investment carries a cost that is not always immediately visible, but becomes significant over time, particularly when it is not reciprocated or when it leads to outcomes that do not align with expectations. For men who have experienced repeated situations where emotional investment did not produce a satisfactory return, there is a tendency to limit that investment, to reserve it for areas where it is more likely to be valued and reciprocated. This does not mean that emotional capacity is reduced, but that it is allocated more selectively, and that selectivity reduces the number of situations where deep engagement occurs. On the other side, there is an increasing recognition that emotional investment is necessary for building meaningful connections. But there is also a hesitation to invest without some indication that the investment will be met with a similar level of commitment. This creates a situation where both sides are waiting for signals from the other before fully engaging, and when those signals are not clearly communicated or are misinterpreted, it leads to a stalemate where neither side moves forward. This kind of dynamic is difficult to resolve because it requires both sides to take a risk at the same time. And in an environment where risk is being minimized, that simultaneous movement becomes less likely. Another factor that is influencing the current state is the way Success and failure are being interpreted because in a system where outcomes are less predictable, people are more likely to attribute results to systemic factors rather than individual actions. And this can lead to a sense of detachment from the process, where effort is seen as less directly connected to outcome. This perception can either lead to disengagement or to a search for more controlled environments where the relationship between effort and outcome is clearer. For many men, the latter has been the chosen path because it provides a sense of agency that is more difficult to achieve in less predictable contexts. At the same time, there is a recognition that not all variables can be controlled and that some level of uncertainty is inherent in any form of interaction, but the tolerance for that uncertainty has decreased, which creates a narrower space for engagement. This narrowing is not absolute, but it is significant enough to influence overall patterns because it reduces the frequency and depth of interactions that are necessary for building connections. There is also an underlying shift in how people perceive responsibility because responsibility is increasingly being internalized rather than externalized, with individuals recognizing that their outcomes are influenced by their decisions, their priorities, and their approach to navigating the environment. This internalization can lead to more deliberate decision making, but it can also lead to a more cautious approach where people are less willing to take risks that could disrupt the stability they have built. For men, this has reinforced the focus on self sufficiency, on building systems that are resilient and independent of external variables, and on maintaining control over their environment. For women, the internalization of responsibility is intersecting with the need to adapt to changing conditions, to reassess strategies, and to find ways to achieve stability in a landscape that is less predictable than it was assumed to be. As these shifts continue to develop, the overall dynamic becomes one where the pathways to connection are more complex, more conditional, and more dependent on alignment across multiple factors, including values, expectations, priorities, and risk tolerance. This complexity does not eliminate the possibility of connection, but it does make it less automatic, less frequent, and more dependent on deliberate effort that is aligned on both sides. The challenge then is not just to recognize that the environment has changed, but to understand how those changes affect the way people interact, the way they make decisions, and the way they prioritize different aspects of their lives. Without that understanding, it is easy to misinterpret the signals, to apply strategies that are no longer effective, and to become frustrated when outcomes do not match expectations. But with that understanding, there is an opportunity to approach the situation with a level of clarity that allows for more effective navigation, to identify the factors that are most relevant, and to adjust behavior in a way that is aligned with the current reality rather than with outdated assumptions. This does not guarantee a specific outcome, but it does increase the likelihood of making decisions that are consistent with both short term conditions and long term goals. As the transition continues, the patterns will become more defined, the signals clearer, and the pathways more visible. But until that point, the process will remain one of an adjustment, of learning, and of adaptation, where individuals are continuously refining their approach based on the feedback they receive from the environment around them. Then, in that process, those who are able to maintain a balance between caution and openness, between control and flexibility, and between independence and connection will be better positioned to navigate the complexities of the current landscape because they will be operating from a place of awareness rather than assumption. And that awareness is what allows for meaningful progress, even in a system that is still in flux. There is a quiet recalibration happening in how people interpret effort itself. And that recalibration is shaping decisions in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become clear when you step back and look at the broader pattern. Because effort is no longer being measured simply by how much is given, but by how effectively it translates into a stable and and predictable outcome over time. For a long time, the assumption was that effort applied consistently would eventually produce a desired result, even if the path was uncertain. But as people experience situations where effort does not produce proportional returns, they begin to question not just the quantity of effort, but the direction of it. And that shift in thinking leads to a more selective approach where effort is directed toward areas that provide a clearer return on investment. This is particularly evident in how men are approaching their lives, because once they identify areas where their input leads to measurable progress, they begin to prioritize those areas and deprioritize those where the outcome is less certain, creating a pattern of behavior that gradually shifts their focus away from traditional engagement and towards systems that offer a more reliable feedback loop. This shift in effort allocation is not just about efficiency, it is about control. Because when effort produces a predictable outcome, it reinforces a sense of agency that is difficult to achieve in environments where the variables are constantly changing and the results are not directly tied to the input. That sense of agency becomes a central factor in decision making because it provides a foundation of stability that allows individuals to plan, to build, and to progress without the need to constantly adjust to external fluctuations. Once that foundation is established, it becomes the reference point against which other opportunities are evaluated. And if those opportunities introduce a level of uncertainty that disrupts that sense of control, they are less likely to be pursued. This creates a reinforcing cycle where stability leads to further stability, and the threshold for introducing new variables becomes higher over time. On the other side, there is a growing awareness that effort alone is not sufficient to produce the outcomes that were once expected, particularly in an environment where the conditions that supported those outcomes have changed. This awareness creates a need to refine not just the approach, but the underlying assumptions about what effort should achieve and how it should be applied. It leads to a search for strategies that can increase the effectiveness of effort, that can improve the likelihood of achieving a desired outcome without requiring an unsustainable level of input. However, without addressing the alignment between expectations and reality, these strategies may only provide incremental improvements rather than a fundamental shift because they are operating within a framework that may no longer be fully compatible with the current environment. Another dimension to consider is the way time horizons have expanded in how people think about their lives. Because as uncertainty increases, there is a tendency to focus more on long term outcomes rather than short term gains. And this shift influences how decisions are made at every level. For men, this often means prioritizing actions that contribute to a stable and sustainable future, even if those actions require sacrificing immediate gratification because the long term benefit outweighs the short term cost. This approach creates a form of consistency that is built on deliberate planning and disciplined execution. And once it becomes habitual, it shapes the overall structure of a person's life in a way that is less susceptible to disruption. For women, the expansion of time horizons is intersecting with a different set of considerations because the path that was promoted as leading to independence and fulfillment is now being evaluated in the context of long term sustainability. And this evaluation can reveal gaps between expectation and outcome that were not fully considered. This creates a need to reassess priorities, to consider alternative approaches, and to navigate a landscape where the balance between independence and connection is not clearly defined. The result is a period of adjustment where individuals are experimenting with different strategies, trying to find a combination that aligns with both their current situation and their long term goals. There is also a shift in how people perceive value in relationships themselves because value is no longer assumed to be inherent in the connection, but is evaluated based on how that connection contributes to stability, growth, and overall well being. This means that relationships are being assessed more critically with a focus on whether they provide a net positive effect on a person's life rather than simply fulfilling a social expectation. For men, this often translates into a more selective approach, where only those interactions that meet a certain threshold of value are pursued, while others are filtered out. This selectivity reduces the number of interactions but increases the importance of those that do occur because they are chosen with greater intention. On the other side, there is an increasing effort to demonstrate value in a way that aligns with this more selective approach, but doing so requires a level of clarity about what is being offered and how it fits into the priorities of the other person. Without that clarity, attempts to establish connection may not resonate because they do not address the criteria that are being used to evaluate value. This creates a situation where both sides are operating with different frameworks for assessing interactions, which contributes to the overall disconnect. Another factor that is influencing the current dynamic is the way uncertainty is being managed at a psychological level, because uncertainty can create a sense of instability that people seek to reduce through various means. And one of the most effective ways to reduce uncertainty is to limit exposure to situations where outcomes are unpredictable. For men, this has often meant focusing on areas where they can control the variables, where the outcome is directly tied to their actions, and where the risk of negative outcomes is minimized. This approach not only reduces uncertainty, but also reinforces a sense of competence and control that contributes to overall satisfaction. For women, managing uncertainty may involve seeking strategies that increase predictability in interactions, that provide clearer signals, and that reduce the likelihood of unfavorable outcomes. However, in a system where both sides are attempting to minimize risk, the result can be a reduction in engagement because each side is waiting for the other to provide the assurance needed to proceed. This creates a dynamic where opportunities are missed, not because they are not present, but because the conditions for engagement are not met. There is also a broader cultural shift in how independence is being interpreted, because independence is no longer seen as an absolute state, but as something that exists on a spectrum with different levels of reliance on external factors depending on the context. This more nuanced understanding allows for a more flexible approach to decision making, where individuals can adjust their level of independence based on their circumstances and priorities. However, achieving this balance requires a level of self awareness and clarity that is not always present, particularly in a rapidly changing environment where the signals are not always clear. As these shifts continue to evolve, the overall landscape becomes one where the pathways to connection are less defined, more conditional, and more dependent on alignment across multiple dimensions. This does not eliminate the possibility of forming meaningful relationships, but it does require a more deliberate approach that takes into account the complexity of the current environment. It requires an understanding of not just what is visible on the surface, but what is driving behavior at a deeper level, including the role of incentives, expectations, and perception. The challenge then is to navigate this complexity without becoming overwhelmed by it, to identify the factors that are most relevant, and to adjust behavior in a way that is aligned with both current conditions and long term objectives. This involves a continuous process of observation, reflection, and adaptation, where individuals are constantly refining their approach based on the feedback they receive from the environment around them. In this process, those who are able to maintain a balance between caution and openness, who can manage uncertainty without becoming paralyzed by it, and who can align their actions with their priorities in a consistent and deliberate way, are more likely to find stability within the changing landscape. This does not mean that the path will be straightforward, but it does mean that it will be grounded in an understanding of reality rather than in assumptions that no longer hold. As the transition continues, the patterns will become more distinct, the signals more consistent, and the opportunities for alignment more visible. But until that point, the environment will remain one of adjustment and learning, where individuals are navigating a space that is still being defined by the collective behavior of those within it. And within that space, the decisions that are made today will shape the conditions of tomorrow because each action contributes to the overall direction of the system. And as those actions accumulate, they create a new equilibrium that reflects the realities of the present rather than the expectations of the past. For men who have already moved into a different framework, acceptance has largely already taken place, not necessarily as a conscious decision, but as a result of consistent outcomes that reinforce their current approach. They are no longer waiting for a return to previous dynamics because their behavior is aligned with the system that is producing results for them in the present. This alignment creates a form of stability that does not depend on external validation or participation. And once that stability is established, it becomes the foundation upon which future decisions are built. It is not a rejection of connection, but it is a rejection of engaging under conditions that do not align with their priorities. And that distinction is important because it explains why attempts to re engage that do not address those priorities are often ineffective. On the other side, the process of acceptance is still unfolding, and it is complicated by the fact that it requires reconciling a gap between what was expected and what is being experienced. This reconciliation involves acknowledging that certain assumptions may no longer hold, that certain paths may not lead to the outcomes that were anticipated, and that adjustments may be necessary to align with current conditions. This is not about assigning blame or identifying a single cause. It is about recognizing that the environment has changed and that behavior must adapt accordingly. The challenge is that adaptation requires clarity, and clarity can only be achieved through a willingness to engage with the underlying dynamics rather than focusing solely on surface level solutions. Another critical aspect of this transition is the role of indifference, because indifference is often misunderstood as negativity or hostility. But in reality, it is a state where something no longer holds enough significance to influence behavior. For many men, the shift toward indifference is not driven by negative emotion, but by a reduction in perceived value. And when something is no longer seen as valuable, it naturally loses its influence over decision making. This is one of the most difficult shifts to address because indifference cannot be countered by increased effort alone. It requires a change in perception that reestablishes value in a way that is consistent and meaningful over time. Without that change, attempts to regain attention or engagement are likely to be met with neutrality rather than resistance. And neutrality is often more difficult to overcome because it lacks the emotional intensity that can be redirected. At the same time, there is a growing awareness that rebuilding any form of connection requires a foundation of trust that has been weakened by the changes that have taken place. And trust is not something that can be restored quickly or through isolated actions. It requires consistency, alignment, and a track record of interactions that reinforce reliability over time. This is a long term process, and it is one that cannot be accelerated without risking further instability because trust built too quickly without a solid foundation is easily broken, and repeated cycles of broken trust contribute to the overall reluctance to engage. This is why the current environment feels slow, because meaningful progress requires patience and a willingness to build gradually rather than seeking immediate results. There is also a shift in how people interpret outcomes, because outcomes are no longer viewed in isolation. but as part of a broader pattern that informs future decisions. When individuals experience a series of interactions that lead to similar results, those results become a reference point that influences how they approach subsequent situations. For men, this often means using past experiences to refine their criteria for engagement, to identify patterns that indicate potential outcomes, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. This creates a more selective approach that reduces exposure to unfavorable outcomes, but also limits the number of opportunities for new experiences. On the other side, there is a tendency to interpret outcomes as signals that require adjustment, leading to efforts to refine behavior in a way that improves the likelihood of achieving a different result. But without addressing the broader pattern, these adjustments may not produce the desired change. Another factor that plays a significant role in the current dynamic is the concept of self sufficiency, because self sufficiency provides a level of independence that reduces reliance on external factors. And as individuals become more self sufficient, their need for external support decreases. For men, this has been a key driver of the shift away from traditional engagement, because the ability to meet their own needs, to manage their own environment, and to maintain control over their outcomes reduces the incentive to seek external input. This does not eliminate the potential for connection, but it changes the criteria under which connection is pursued, because it must now provide value beyond what can be achieved independently. This raises the threshold for engagement and contributes to the overall reduction in interaction. On the other side, there is an increasing recognition that complete self sufficiency may not be sustainable in all contexts, particularly as external conditions become more challenging. And this recognition creates a need to balance independence with connection in a way that provides both autonomy and support. Achieving this balance requires a clear understanding of priorities and a willingness to adjust behavior in a way that aligns with those priorities. But this process is complicated by the fact that the signals that guide decision making are not always clear, and the environment itself is still evolving. As all of these factors come together, the overall picture becomes one of a system that is undergoing a fundamental realignment, where the old patterns have been disrupted and new patterns are still emerging, creating a period of uncertainty that requires careful navigation. This navigation is not about finding a quick solution, but about developing an approach that is flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions while remaining grounded in a clear understanding of what is most important. It involves recognizing that the environment is dynamic, that behavior must evolve in response to new information, and that stability is achieved not through rigid adherence to a fixed path, but through the ability to adjust in a way that maintains alignment with both current realities and long term objectives. For those who are able to approach this process with a level of clarity and intentionality, there is an opportunity to build a framework that is more resilient, more adaptable, and more aligned with the conditions of the present rather than the expectations of the past. This does not mean that the process will be without challenges, but it does mean that those challenges can be navigated in a way that leads to meaningful progress rather than ongoing frustration. It requires a willingness to let go of assumptions that no longer serve, to engage with the complexity of the situation, and to make decisions based on an understanding of the underlying dynamics rather than on surface level perceptions. And that is where everything ultimately leads. Because when you strip away the noise, when you look past the narratives, when you focus on what is actually happening rather than what is being said about it, the picture becomes clear. The environment has changed. The incentives have shifted, the patterns of behavior have adapted, and the outcomes are reflecting those changes in a way that cannot be ignored. This is not a temporary phase, it is a transition that is reshaping how people interact, how they make decisions, and how they structure their lives moving forward. For those who have already adapted, the path is relatively stable because it is aligned with the current conditions. For those who are still in the process of adjusting, the path may feel uncertain, but it is not without direction because the signals are there for those who are willing to see them and to interpret them without bias. The key is not to resist the reality of what is happening, but to understand it, to engage with it, and to use that understanding to inform decisions that are consistent with both immediate needs and long term goals. That is the wake up call that sits underneath everything, not as a dramatic statement, but as a quiet realization that the world does not remain static, that conditions evolve, that behavior follows incentives, and that the ability to adapt to those changes is what ultimately determines the outcome. It is not about assigning fault. It is not about proving a point. It is about recognizing that the structure has shifted and that continuing to operate as if it has not will only lead to further misalignment. So the question becomes simple, even if the answer is not, which is whether to continue holding on to a framework that no longer reflects reality or to step into a new one that does, even if that requires a level of adjustment that is uncomfortable in the short term. Because in the end, comfort in the present does not guarantee stability in the future. And stability in the future is built on decisions that align with reality, not with expectation. And for those who have made it this far, who have followed this all the way through, who have stayed with it long enough to see the full picture rather than just the surface, you already know what this means. You already feel it. And that is why you are here at the end, because you are not looking for noise. You are looking for clarity. And clarity is what allows you to move forward without confusion. Shout out to the 1 hour gang for staying locked in all the way through, because most people do not have the patience to sit with something long enough to actually understand it. And that alone puts you in a different position moving forward. If you have been getting value from these Angry Guy talks and you want to support, you can grab me a Red Bull through the link in the description and keep this thing running, because this kind of conversation does not exist in many places and it only continues if people actually value it. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think about everything that was laid out here? Do you agree with it? Do you see the same patterns, or do you see something different? Because the conversation matters just as much as the message. And the only way to refine understanding is to bring more perspectives into it. Like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.